All right, so for lecture 10, I'm going to do a couple of videos to help you guys with drawing and labeling some things. First and foremost, we're going to look at the most important information that was from 10.1, which is the spinal cord. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw and label the parts of the spinal cord, like just basic anatomy of the spinal cord. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where the different parts of the neuron are in the different areas of the spinal cord. Okay. So if you have your PowerPoint here, maybe you printed this out and you're going to draw on top of it, or you have an iPad, you can draw on top of it. The first thing we're going to see is we're taking a cross section here of the spinal cord. Essentially, let's just like kind of draw a spinal cord here in a frontal view. All right, this is probably not going to be the greatest drawing of all times, but maybe it will help you. So let's just say that this is the brain, okay, where the skull is, and then we're going to see that the spinal cord obviously comes off of the brain stem here, and it's going to go through that giant hole that's in the skull, and that's the foramen magnum. And then it's going to end, remember, at the L1, L2 region. So it's not going to be very, very long. I mean, it's going to be long, but it's not going to be as long as you think it's going to be because it's not going all the way to your sacral region, right? So basically all I did here for this picture that I provided to you is I took a cross section. So I'm going to look at this cross section and I'm going to draw and label on top of the cross section. So what you want to know is what's anterior, what's posterior, what's on the what's superficial and what's deep, okay? So how can we figure this out? So I told you you'd always have a spinal nerve associated with this picture. If you don't have a spinal nerve associated with this picture, we want to remember that there's going to be a very deep fissure. So we see this deeper like indentation. That deeper indentation is going to be on the anterior/ventral side of the spinal cord. So this is going to be our anterior, otherwise known as our ventral median fissure. Okay, so the fissure is that really big, deep indent. And then on the posterior side, you should see that this part right here, I'm just going to kind of make a little darker. That part right there is going to indicate that this is posterior. So this is the posterior, otherwise known as the dorsal median sulcus. So the difference between the fissure and the sulcus is the sulcus is not going to be as deep of a depression and the fissure will be a deeper depression. You'll get to see this when we look at the sheep's brain, the difference between a fissure and a sulcus. Okay. Excuse me. So we're going to see on the superficial portion of our spinal cord, we're going to have this area here that's labeled white because it's on a white background, but this is going to be my white matter area. And here you want to understand that the white matter is going to be made of myelinated axons. So axons with myelin. So thinking about the function here of what the white matter is going to do, this is going to transmit messages towards the brain and from the brain because it's just made of axons. Okay, then you want to think about the myelin sheath is made by, which neuroglia cell, and hopefully you write here the oligodendrocytes. All right. So if we go back to our frontal view here of our spinal cord, what you can also do is just put a nice line like that, and we're going to say that this is our anterior median fissure. Just to help you realize like what area we're looking at when we're looking at this picture of the spinal cord. Okay, so superficial is going to be the white matter. And then this butterfly here that I've already drawn for you, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to draw these butterfly-like wings perfectly. It's a lot easier when you already have an outline. That's going to be the gray matter. So here on the left, I'm going to label all the gray matter areas, and then on the right, I'm going to put what's inside of those areas specifically. So we're just going to kind of cordon this off a little bit. So let's do this. Let's label this first. This is the central canal. So the central canal is where we have our cerebrospinal fluid, and remember that's the hollow part that was part of the dorsal hollow nerve tube or dorsal hollow nerve cord. And then we're just going to cordon off our wings, kind of just as you basically would, like this, and then we'll have a little piece like right about there, and then we'll have a little piece right about there. So this part here, and I actually need to maybe redraw my arrow just a little bit so I have enough room to write what this is. So this part right here is going to be my posterior, otherwise known as the dorsal gray horn. Because it's going towards the posterior aspect. And then that part right there is going to be more laterally situated, right? Remember, medial is in the middle. So that's why it's a median fissure. So this is my lateral gray horn. So there's no other term for that one. And then this other portion right there, this is going to be the anterior, otherwise known as the ventral gray horn. So if the white matter area that's surrounding our gray matter butterfly is made of axons that are surrounded by myelin, we're going to remember that the gray matter is made of dendrites and cell bodies. And you really want to think about the cell bodies. It's a little easier to think about that. But dendrites and cell bodies are going to make up the gray area that is the deep inside part of the spinal cord. And we're going to remember there's 4 different types of neurons that we can have: somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, visceral motor. We only have 3 horns, but we have 4 different types of neurons. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but we're still going to color code them. So I'm going to make my sensory stuff blue, and I'm just going to make myself a little key right up here. So this darker blue, I'm going to make this somatic sensory. And then I'm going to make my lighter blue is going to be visceral sensory. And hopefully I can remember exactly what your PowerPoint looked like in terms of the colors. I think I remember. Then we're going to use orange. Orange is going to be my visceral sensory. I'm sorry, visceral motor neurons, or representing them. Okay, and then I'm going to make red as my somatic motor. So remember, somatic means of the body, so we're talking about the skin and skeletal muscles, and when we're talking about visceral, we're talking about things associated with organs. So usually that's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. For motor, for sensory, they go to the same locations. So what we're going to remember is the posterior aspect always has to be sensory, and the anterior aspect always has to be motor. So that means that our posterior gray horn, since this is cell bodies, what we're going to see is we're just going to divide this kind of in half right about here, and I'm just going to put little bubbles in there, and that's going to represent the cell bodies for my somatic sensory. So think about somatic sensory is like that. It's going to be more towards the posterior side on the periphery. Just like somatic stuff will be on the outside of the body, or like towards the body wall, towards the edge. And then I'm going to have visceral sensory ones. So I'm going to make a couple more cell bodies right here, and that's going to represent my visceral sensory cell bodies that are going to be part of my posterior gray horn. The next one I'm going to do is my visceral motor. So right here where I have my lateral gray horn, I'm just going to make some bubbles like this, and that's going to represent where I have my visceral motor cell bodies. I almost forgot. Visceral motor. Then the last one is in the anterior gray horn, you're going to have your somatic motor cell bodies. Okay. And don't worry about like, oh, is there more stuff here versus more stuff there? Yeah, a little bit. But you don't quite know that yet because you don't understand the visceral motor portion just yet. So this is going to be somatic motor. So what you should realize is sensory is posterior, motor is anterior. And then the other really good trick to remember is all the somatic stuff is on the outside of the butterfly wing. Right here we have somatic, which is on the outside, and somatic, which is on the outside. And the skin and skeletal muscles are closer to the outside of the body or towards the surface of the body. So here we're getting closer to the surface of the spinal cord. And then the visceral stuff is always inside of our body. So we see how the visceral sensory and the visceral motor are inside or in the inner portion of our gray matter butterfly. Okay, it's not really called the gray matter butterfly, but it looks like a butterfly. So this is the stuff you want to understand, and then you also want to maybe transplant this to how we're going to build a spinal nerve as well, because where these cell bodies are going to be important. So just so you understand exactly what's happening here, is that you're going to have these cell bodies for sensory, and they're going to come back here, and they're going to go up along the dorsal side of the spinal cord, like this, towards the brain. And then what we're going to see is that coming from the brain, we're going to have motor information, and those axons that are part of the white matter are going to be laterally situated and anteriorly situated. So this information is going to come from the brain in that direction towards our cell body, and also in this direction towards our cell body, right? And then the cell bodies are also going to be connected to basically more axons, and those are either bringing the information in or they're taking the information out of the spinal cord itself. And that's how we're going to build our spinal nerve, okay? So this is hopefully very simple, straightforward. I know students hate it when I say that, but if you draw it out, it's not as bad as it seems. This information can actually be a lot worse. I could make you know all the little axon areas as well. What I mean is in the white matter, there are specific names for where certain axons are placed. But now you just want to understand cell bodies are in the gray matter butterfly that's deep inside of the spinal cord, and the axons are going to be superficial, which is in the white matter area that surrounds that, right? The axons are sending the messages either up towards the brain or down from the brain, and they have to hit the cell bodies because the cell bodies are going to be not exactly the receptive areas. I mean, the receptive areas are the dendrites, but the dendrites are closer in terms of their attachment to the cell body because our dendrites are nice and small. So knowing the different areas of the spinal cord and what they're composed of is going to help us as we look at spinal nerve anatomy. It also helps you tie in this overlapping functions. The only thing that you don't know here is that as soon as sensory comes in some cases, it will go right back out of the motor stuff in the spinal cord directly. What I mean by that is you can have some neurons that basically go in this direction here, and they're going to transmit our sensory not to the brain, but directly to like a somatic motor neuron to send the message out immediately. Those are called interneurons. But we're not going to worry too much about those ones. Okay. So you should be able to take that picture and then redraw it again when we look at the spinal nerve anatomy, which will be in a couple more videos.